Today we discuss about request lifecycle concept in Laravel. So in this we have main concepts like introduction, lifecycle overview, focus on service providers, and apart from these we are having subtopics like first steps, HTTP or console kernels, service providers, routing, and finishing up. So these are the main topics and subtopics that are available in request lifecycle. So let's see lifecycle overview. The entry point for all requests via Laravel application is public / index.php file. All requests are dedicated to this file by our web browser, Apache, or Nginx configuration. So the index.php file doesn't contain much code, rather it is a starting point for loading the rest of the framework. The index.php file loads the composer generated autoloader definition and then retrieves an instance of the Laravel application from bootstrap / app.php. The first action taken by Laravel itself is to create an instance of the application or service container. Now we see HTTP console kernels. The incoming request is sent to either the HTTP kernel or the console kernel using the handle request or handle command method of the application instance depending on the type of request entering the application. These two kernels serve as the central location through which all requests flow. So the HTTP kernel defines an array of bootstrappers that will be run before the request is executed. These bootstrappers configure error handling, configure logging, detect the application environment, and perform other tasks that need to be done before the request is actually handled. The HTTP kernel is also responsible for passing the request through the application's middleware stack. These middleware handle reading and writing the HTTP session, determining if the application is in maintenance mode, verifying the CSRF token, and many more. The method signature for the HTTP kernel's handle method is quite simple. It receives a request and returns a response. Now we see service providers. One of the most important kernel bootstrapping actions is loading the service providers for our application. Service providers are responsible for bootstrapping all of the framework's various components such as the database, queue, validation, and routing components. Laravel it will iterate through this list of providers and instantiate each of them. After instantiating the providers, the register method will be called on all of the providers. So then once all of the providers have been registered, the boot method will be called on each provider. This is so service providers may depend on every container binding being registered and available by the time their boot method is executed. Essentially, every major feature offered by Laravel is bootstrapped and configured by a service provider. Now we see routing, and before that we have while the framework internally uses dozens of service providers, so we also have the option to create our own. So we can find a list of the user defined or third-party service providers that our application is using in the bootstrap slash providers.php file. So in this file we will be having either user-defined or third-party service providers. Now we see routing. So once the application has been bootstrapped and all service providers have been registered. So once the application has been bootstrapped and all service providers have been registered, the request will be handed off to the router for dispatching. So the router will dispatch the request to a router or controller, to a route or controller, as well as run any route specific middleware. Middleware provide a convenient mechanism for filtering or examining HTTP requests entering our application. So Laravel includes a middleware that verifies if the user of our application is authenticated. So if the user is not authenticated, the middleware will redirect and the user to the login screen. So if the user is authenticated, the middleware will allow the request to proceed further into the application. So some middleware are assigned to all of the routes within the application, like prevent requests during maintenance, while some are only assigned to specific routes or route groups. If the request passes through all of the matched routes assigned middleware, the route or controller method will be executed and the response returned by the route or controller method will be sent back through the routes chain of middleware. Once the route or controller method returns a response, the response will travel back outward through the route's middleware, giving the application a chance to modify or examine the outgoing response. So finally, once the response travels back through the middleware, the HTTP kernel's handle method returns the response object to the handle request of the application instance, and this method calls the send method on the returned response. The send method sends the response content to the user's web browser. So we have now completed our journey. So through this entire Laravel request lifecycle. So this is all about Laravel request lifecycle. So this is a complete life cycle of a Laravel request. And if we come to service providers, so service providers are truly the key to bootstrapping a Laravel application. So the application instance is created, the service providers are registered, and the request is handed to the bootstrapped application. So this is all about service providers and request lifecycle. So by default, the app service provider is fairly empty. This provider is a great place to add our application's own bootstrapping and service container bindings. So this is all about request lifecycle concept in Laravel. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of my fans, supporters and followers, and special thanks to all of my YouTube subscribers. This is Universal Horse Star Ravindar Reddy Yampalla. Thank you so much.